Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So we are a bit late in this workshop. So welcome to this panel discussion on creating and documenting datasets for AI. My name is Isabelle Hupon, and here is my colleague Songul Tolan. We are both scientific project officers at the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and we work on human-centered AI in a group called HUMAINT. And yeah, I'm an engineer. Songul is a...
I'm an economist with specifics in social policy.
Exactly, but we both work on trustworthy AI, and human-centered trustworthy AI. So we will be moderating this session. So this panel comes right after a series of presentations that have provided an excellent overview of the current landscape of AI ethics and trustworthy AI and data quality principles related to it. And also a landscape on ongoing regulations and standardization roadmaps that are ongoing. Here in this panel, it's a bit more scientific. Perhaps, no, we aim to put the focus on data sets, really, on data. No, the data is the raw material we need to train, test, validate AI models. So it's extremely important and it's central to any AI development. So we have 4 outstanding panelists in this session, coming from very different backgrounds and institutions. We have Felix Naumann, professor on information systems at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam. We have Emmanuel Kahembui. He is the CEO at VDE UK. We have Kezia Chmielewski, co-founder of the Data Nutrition Project. I'm sorry, Kezia, I mispronounced your last name for sure. Then you can arrange it. And then we have Flora Dellinger from Valeo France and Confiance.ai. So we will be using the tool Slido. I'm sure you are familiar with it. Perhaps, Livia, you can move to the next slide. I think we have the QR code, exactly. So we will use Slido for the interaction between the audience and the speakers and myself. And you can scan this QR code on your mobile phone, or you can connect to slido.com and you tap the hashtag standards for AI. And then you have to enter the dataset for AI room, and then you will be done and you can ask questions and participate in the polls and everything. So for Zoom, for the tool Zoom we are using right now, we please ask you to turn your camera and audio off. It should be, normally it should be like this, and use the chat only for technical questions, but not for interacting with the speakers. So we now move fastly because we have this delay to a 10 to 15 minute individual presentation of each panelist, after which we will all reflect together on the further steps and standardization efforts that are needed for the creation of high quality data sets for AI. So I leave now the floor to Felix Naumann. Please, Felix, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So we had 10 to 15 minutes, but only 3 slides. So I think I'll be able to catch up a little bit. But Livia, we wanted to start exactly. I have prepared a very quick poll just as a quick warm-up for my few slides. So if you will, be great if you can, very quickly fill in the survey. I'll do the same on my phone here as well, thus biasing the result a little bit. Okay, so Okay, I guess, so I'm assuming, I don't know quite how this works, but you can see live the results here. And I'm, of course, fully expecting this result. I think 10 of you have filled this out. The questions were basically about data, as Isabel pointed out originally. And the first question, ever experienced a data file not loading properly? I guess we all have, at least if we have worked with data. And loading properly could refer to opening it in Excel. It could refer to importing it into a database, or it could just mean using it, let's say, in a Pandas framework to build, to train a machine learning model. So next question, 13 of you responded. Oh, everybody says, yes, you've opened a CSV file and have seen a mess of data and text inside. Why is this a problem? Because this data is unusable if you don't use any data preparation. I'll talk about that in a second. And then maybe the last question. Thanks for continuing to answer this. So I guess many of you have already seen these kind of statistics. How much effort is actually to perform data preparation and cleaning? This is one of the things that is dear to me. And I think this is also important for the topic of this panel, creating and documenting data sets, because for the creation of the data set, but also for the documenting of the data set, because all the data preparation and cleaning should be documented a little bit, right? And I see a quarter of you said even greater than 80% of the overall project effort. So we're training all these great data scientists, and all they're doing every day is opening CSV files and trying to fix them, right? And at least the computer scientists among us know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so thanks for participating. Let's move to my first slide. Great. So this is just a quick introductory slide where we were asked to introduce ourselves. So I'm a computer scientist, did my PhD in the area of information integration and information quality, which, this was in the year 2000. So I'm very happy to see that suddenly this is a big issue, not just in the business area where I had my most of my research areas or application areas, but now also, of course, in AI. I did research at Humboldt University. I've had sabbaticals at all sorts of companies, as you can see. And since 2006, I'm here at the Hasso-Plattner Institute, which is a privately funded university institute. It belongs to the University of Potsdam here in Germany, and it's a computer science institute. We have bachelor, master, PhD programs, just like any normal computer science institute at a university. So the topics that I've been working on, or that are most fitting to what we're talking about here, are basically two steps: data profiling, in particular to measure data quality, and data cleaning to improve data quality. And as we all know, we cannot improve what we cannot measure. And so I think this aspect should not be forgotten, right? And we've done a lot of work in this area of data profiling, so analyzing huge data sets to find typically dependencies and then their violations to then clean the data. So if you know that something should be true in the data, we will discover that it is only approximately true and then guide you towards data cleaning. In this area of data cleaning, I've done a lot of work in duplicate detection. This is typically not quite as relevant for AI. It's more for, let's say, customer relationship management, but nevertheless, it's an important topic. But then, as mentioned already, we're doing a lot of work in this area of data preparation. And I define data preparation as everything before cleaning. So literally preparing the, let's say, syntactic aspect of your data, no matter the actual content of your data. And I'm not worried, at least in that part of the research, I'm not worried about, is the value in there true or not? Is Felix truly born in 1971 or not? But I'm worried about the date format in which this data is formatted. And I'd like to clean that, because if you don't do that, everything down the pipeline will also contain errors or be wrong or will not be able to interpret, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm involved in this KitKar project that you can see here on the right-hand side. I'm mentioning this because this is specifically about a research project funded by the German Ministry for, Arbeit und Soziales, so the Work and Social Ministry of Germany. And I mentioned this because Sebastian Hallensleben is the leader of this project, whom you just heard a little bit earlier in the plenary session. Okay, so with this, I think we can move to the next slide. So the theme of our research is the one that you can see here, right? Bad files lead to bad data, and then they will lead to bad results. right? And so why is bad files? So the questions I asked earlier, why is this a problem? Because my suspicion and my experience is that developers, data scientists, they choose the path of least resistance to train an AI model or a machine learning model. So if data sets are broken, they will not be used. If data sets contain a bunch of lines that are improperly formatted, they'll just be deleted instead of repaired, just so we can move forward in our data science pipeline. And I've seen this again and again. There's always this trade-off of how much effort do I put into the data preparation steps, and can I measure how useful it is to put this effort into my preparation, or you know, I might as well maybe just leave it and hope for the best. So next, please. Some of you have seen these statistics. This is alluding to my third question, what data scientists spend most time doing. As you can see here, 60% of the time they spend cleaning and organizing data, right? Super annoying. And then the next 19% is collecting the data, which to me also is in a sense the data preparation, choosing which data sets do I use, looking into the data set, can I use it? This is also in a sense part of the data preparation. So if you sum it up, you're almost at 80%. Next, please. The next statistic then also tells us that this is the least enjoyable part of data scientists, right? And since it's least enjoyable, data scientists will try to avoid doing it. And they try to avoid doing it by, as I said, maybe choosing poor quality data sets to train their models, or choosing different data sets that might not be quite as adequate, or by finding another job, right? So next, please. So what are the challenges more specifically? Livia, next, please. Or whoever's clicking. Next. Okay, there we go. So some challenges. So the first challenge, as I said, you cannot optimize what you cannot measure. So we want to detect and measure problems. And there's a huge amount of data quality research. We heard in the plenary session just earlier that bias is an important part, bias in the training data, bias in the testing data. And there are many other novel, more AI-specific quality dimensions. The typical ones are completeness and accuracy and timeliness and all these things, but suddenly we want diversity, we want fairness, we want liability, we want costs. We have all sorts of novel quality dimensions that need to be, let's say, understood, measured, and then surfaced to the user. Next, please. Next challenge is then, of course, reacting upon that. So how do we prepare and clean data for AI? And data cleaning is a topic that's been, you know, well studied, and there's some cool systems. But if you ask me in terms of how much has this actually reached industry, we're just a tiny step you know, beyond the baseline of manually cleaning things. I think there's a lot of research that can still be done to help data scientists. This task, in a sense, in and of itself, is already AI complete. We won't ever have a system that will completely automatically prepare and clean your data, but we need to develop tools to help data scientists do this. Next, please. The third challenge. This is what I was alluding to earlier, and which fits the best, I think, to the theme of this particular panel, is transparent documentation of these steps, right? So at least from my researcher perspective, I see so many papers where the scientists said, we cleaned the data set and then we trained a model with it. And I have no idea what they did to the data set. Did they remove everything that they didn't like? Did they you know, actually clean data errors? Did they do formatting? And I think this is a very important topic also for the simple concept of repeatability and reproducibility of experiments. And here we also have a long way to go. So we want to document data quality measures, and we want to document every single cleaning step that the scientists or data scientists undertook to clean and massage and prepare the data. If you don't do that, there's no way to understand or reproduce a system, an AI system. Next slide, please. So way forward, this was our template here. So the way forward is, of course, understanding these quality dimensions. So which established dimensions are relevant, and then which new dimensions do we need, right? And which established dimensions are relevant? Well, you have to look at what you're looking at. Which learning tasks are you doing? Are you doing a clustering approach? Are you doing classification? Is this a regression model? What are you actually doing? And then where in the pipeline are you? Are you in the data preparation phase? Are you in the model training phase? Are you in the testing phase? Are you in the application phase? And each time different dimensions are particularly relevant, right? And as I said earlier, these are lots of new dimensions like privacy, bias, liability, explainability. This is something new that at least the data cleaning, data quality, information quality community has not looked at. And then my final remark is, and the next step is, as I said, assessment and also explanation of data quality. So measuring data quality, which ones are automatically measurable or testable, and can we do this efficiently? We're talking about large data sets. We don't want to wait a week to find out it's incomplete, right? And then also explaining the data quality. So explainable AI is a common topic. I would argue explainable data quality is also something quite interesting so that users can actually understand, data scientists can actually understand the problems in their data and can, move forward by improving the quality. Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to my co-panelists.
Okay, so do I assume I can just proceed? Okay then. Well, I'll just proceed. I'm Emmanuel. I'm next slide, I guess. So yeah, I'm Emmanuel Kahembwe. Background in AI and robotics, dual PhDs in both. Experience with on the research side, leading the Alexa AI Prize from Edinburgh University. Actually trying to get AI working in the real world, which was interesting. And then actually more recently and very relevant to the topic of this panel is we co-wrote a paper on multimodal datasets, because that's taking a slightly different spin to what Felix has presented thus far. I'm very much on the larger scale of things, the big language models, the type of stuff that you hear being hailed out of the Googles and the Microsoft, and that just consume half the internet and then regurgitate it in some convoluted form, and it's labeled as AGI. Anyways, so professionally, I also lead the VDE branch in the UK, but I'm also the chief AI architect for VDE EV, which is headquartered in Offenbach, and have standardization experience, I guess, through the Standard ICT EOS group and the British Standards Institute, part of the Art1 AI committee. Of relevance to this area and this the topic of this panel is the work that we have done at VDE on, for example, the AI Trust Label, which is the first, I guess, the real attempt at getting industry to conform to the AI Act, and particularly to the realistically thinking about the compliance of this act preemptively. And the reason why it's useful here is that it's been this task of translating what is seen in the AI Act into a set of metrics that can actually be used to measure the quality of processes involved in data collection, data processing, but then also aligning it with the work that's coming out of different groups, especially the research groups, the ethics groups like Tim Gabriel, when we're talking about data sheets and model cards, and even things like the AI nutrition level. So that's out now, the first version of that, and that's also highly relevant. And lastly, there's also the AI Quality and Testing Hub, which we are doing in collaboration with the Ministry of Hessen, which is in effect our first attempt at trying to see if we can actually, in reality, judge models and judge processes as in terms of compliance to things like the AI Act. Can we actually ensure compliance, and can we measure it, and can we certify it? And so this is an institute that is, I guess, at the forefront of actually trying to see how much of the theory actually translates into the real world. And hopefully that's going to be a continuous process where we feed back into the policy and the standards. Next slide, please. So around the big AI, big data, kind of large model approach to AI, there's a central capability enabling this is on one hand, access to lots of compute, so the GPU stuff, scaling with GPU, but then the other hand, it's the increase in the increase in availability of data, and it's become standard in our field to be able to just, at least in the AI field, to sit there and be able to scrape the internet and consume, petabytes of data and attempt to clean those and compress them down into a neural network typically, and then forget about all the issues around that, primarily around them copyright, as in, do you even have a right to do something like that? To really just consume a huge amount of information online that's was not really created for that purpose, to just consume that and compress it and use it for your AI model. And then I put provenance there too, because occasionally these models will have the ability to kind of verbatim regurgitate data that they have consumed, these AI models, which means that if you are using them, as many of these companies are, as the base of many products, if somebody's able to, let's say, interact with the AI model in a particular kind of way, they can pull information back out of it, which could be quite sensitive. And then the second issue that I see, particularly with the way the field is going right now, and is not really considered much in the standardization world, is the multimodal aspect. Recently, there's been this hype, especially this year, around multimodal AI models. These are models that consume and generate information based on both language and vision. And the way they do this is basically trolling the web for images with alternative text, so to speak. And then there's questions there about the quality of alternative text, whether it actually aligns with the images. How do we actually able to track that, if you're using such data, how are you actually able to, at the scale that it's being used that which we're talking about billions of images. Currently, there's a data set out there, 5 billion I believe. They collected 5 billion image text pairs. And the aspect of assuring that this data set does not include, especially when you're talking images, when it doesn't include illicit material of things like, underage children, people who have not consented to having the images up online, for example. So thinking about what this means in terms of regulations and standards, I don't think anyone has really kind of started to scratch yet. And I also mentioned search engine bias there, because this whole multimodal angle of things where you see, oh yes, this Google AI model can now generate pictures when you give it a bunch of words. They forget that because they're using alternative text, most of the images online are, the people who provide alternative text for images online have typically an incentive, at least the ones who provide most of the images that actually have some form of alternative text attached to them. And that's from trying to prime search engines, because they're trying to climb the search engine results. In other words, it's also trying to also attract a particular demographic. And in some of the work that we've done so far, especially around multimodal data sets, we found that innocent images of girls who are primed with schoolgirls going to school are primed with things that are aimed to attract, for example, pedophiles. And this is being consumed by these AI models and projected out there. So there's a whole question of curation here that becomes very hard when you go from text to even images and being able to analyze images and see what's concretely in an image. It's a circular problem, so to speak. And then again, with curation, there's problems when you have a data set that big. People want to be removed. Some people don't want the images online. They change their mind at some point. How do you assure that, some scientist or some researcher somewhere or some company is able to remove a set of images? Say you decide that, okay, these images shouldn't be online for X, Y, or Z reason. And also, the last thing I say regarding inclusivity, especially around web scraping, is that a lot of people often forget that the internet is itself quite, let's say, US-centric, as in it does not represent the world. It does not represent the languages of the world, the cultures of the world. even restricting to Europe, it does not capture or represent that. And so, again, from a standards and regulatory perspective, there are open questions there, but then also from a curation perspective to make sure that these, if you're using such data sets to prime your model, to train your models, and this is what is done, is that they're trained, you pre-train a base model that you then specialize for specific tasks, but the base model is trained on this data that is primarily US-centric, and then applied to some random region in Portugal, for example. There's questions there about how should we be thinking about this. And then documentation is basically non-existent at this scale. I mean, the only documentation is that, yes, we collected and we excluded X, Y, and Z websites. But apart from that, everything else on those sites are, part of, there's really no ability to document beyond saying that these are the sources of where we are scraping, aggressively. And then lastly, access. Typically, the organizations that have been collecting these data sets have been private US tech companies. They're the ones who have access to this data and they've been using it. And even as a researcher, if you wanted to work on similar problems, you'd have to either be inside one of these big tech companies because they do not release it because this is part of their secret sauce. Recently, there's been grassroots movements, which is it's called Lion. I believe it's a group from France. It's a grassroots movement to collect a similar data set. And that allowed us to write this paper that was auditing it and critiquing the type of data that's found here. And this is now a publicly accessible 5 billion image data set, but then even being able to clean and maintain that is beyond the ability of this grassroots movement. So there's a question as to if there should be particular bodies that actually assess the quality of how well companies actually clean their data sets, especially at this scale. If there should be some kind of random sampling and random auditing of, especially I would say the big tech companies that do deploy these models and let them automatically predict, for example, the text that when you're writing your emails, because again, this is all based on a huge data set with lots of issues that nobody else has access to outside of these companies. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned before, we've, at least at VDE, we've tried to get industry more kind of aligned with the AI Act, and that's meant, and especially around some of the issues I mentioned before, we've tried to at least get them talking the same language. We're bringing data sheets and model cards and stuff that's happening. I believe also we have a speaker here on the nutrition label. But there's already documentation that's been proposed from the researchers, and it's an aspect of aligning that with the desires of regulators and legislators and finding a middle ground. And we've done, I guess there is quite a bit more work to be done there to actually form consensus on how everyone will operate. But there is preliminary work there, but it's not enough, I would say. I also say that we need to seriously think about auditing, standardized auditing of especially companies that do deploy models at scale using data that's collected at scale without any ability to actually to inspect that from the outside. I think it's highly dangerous because then the issues are so pervasive and so subtle that it would be hard to again end up with the situation that was mentioned earlier, where end up with a reactive system where a lot of biases get ingrained and perpetuated, and until the harm is realized at scale, nothing is done. And so beyond that, we're talking about checklists, we're talking about the AI trust label, and then also more development on algorithmic tools, because when you're collecting at least data at scale, cleaning it at scale is still a challenge. It's computationally heavy. There is some methods out there right now, the Shapley values, influence functions that let you know how a particular data or set of data affects your predictions of your model, or how it biases your model. We need more tools. These are currently the most prominent. But even being able to sit them there and use them is still in a usable form, as in a tool that allows you to filter and delete samples that or parts of your data that are undesirable. And even to identify and delete that remains a challenge, especially again at scale. And lastly, I would say the labeling tools. I have seen many efforts from especially the autonomous car industry to improve labeling tools. But outside of the autonomous car industry, for everyone else, especially giving example of the current thing of training these big multimodal foundational AI models, assuring that you are actually using the correct labels and that your labels, especially in our work, we found that, for example, labels seem to get worse when you're dealing with, for example, minority groups. You know, that being able to identify those and correct labels for your data sets is it's still severely lacking, let's see. And I think that's all. And can you go to the next slide? I think that's the last of my slides. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. So yeah, one more slide. So yeah, I would argue that we need a clear roadmap or set of standards or guidelines on at least European-wide on the large-scale collection curation of web script data, specifically web script data, because there is large data sets in the biomedical industry, and there's a lot of efforts to make sure those are also, you know, treated in a particular way. But web script or data collected from the web presents a particular challenge simply because of the number of jurisdictions involved, how at least a lot of these companies are very multinational, where they carry out one thing in one country and then apply it in another country. So there's many questions there about how to actually enforce a standard and actually make sure companies do adhere to that. And then the next thing is to align current AI practices with existing laws and regulations. I would say that we've done a lot in Europe to put together laws to protect people. But what you end up seeing in industry, again, because there is little to no accountability right now, is that it's very far removed and there is no onus to change thus far. Metrics are also still missing because there's no standardized form of metrics to actually measure data quality, which is the point that Felix, I guess, covered before, is that yeah, we don't have any standardized metrics to actually be like, okay, this data set is arguably or definitely better than another data set collected in a similar way. And there's no standard set of tools. So typically you have every organization developing their own set of tools, and some with much better filtering tools. For example, Google, probably one of the best filtering tools since they clean the entire internet, versus, you know, other companies that are trying to compete in the same space who are not able to actually clean their data or document their data to that level because they simply don't have the same scale of resources as Google or the experience. As in, Google has been doing this for over 20 years. They've been curating and cleaning up the web for everybody. So they are actually trying to take advantage of any data on the web compared to any other company that's out there. And that's a consideration to have, especially for European companies trying to compete in the same space. And I do believe that is my last slide. So next slide, please. And yeah, thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel and Felix. Sorry, I was accidentally muted right after Felix's speech. I would like to thank both of you for these engaging talks. And we were saying with some good that you were speaking right to our scientific hearts with this problem of data cleaning. People tell you, normal people, oh, you work on AI, it must be exciting. Yes, well, I spend the whole morning cleaning data. Yeah, it's exciting to work on AI. So yeah, it's our life. It's also web scrapping. We also dealt with this problem of massive data from the internet and then cleaning them. And
the US-centric focus, yeah.
Exactly.
Indeed.
So yeah, we feel understood. And I think that the audience is feeling the same way. And of course, we need the guidelines for documentation. And here comes Keisha with the Data Nutrition Project. I have to confess, I'm a big fan of your project. And so perhaps you will provide us with some light on documentation for datasets. So I leave the floor to you.
Great. Can you hear me okay? All good? All
Yep.
right. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Kasia Shimolinski, and I'm the co-founder of the Data Nutrition Project, and also I currently am a fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. Next slide, please. So my background's maybe a little different. I do have education, but it's not primary focus anymore because I've been in industry for so long. I have a degree actually in physics from Harvard, but I've been in industry for 15 years and in research for the last 5, in addition to industry. And I've worked across a number of domains, sizes of organizations, some government, some on the consulting side, some in academia. And on the research, starting with the Data Nutrition Project in 2017, I really jumped into this question of data set standards because of what I saw in industry, which is very aligned. I was just nodding up and down. I don't know if you could see me, but Felix and Emmanuel was just saying, yes, I've seen all these things as a product manager, building these systems. Zest AI, for example, is a financial startup in 2010, which is very early in terms of big data and trying to do these things. I saw this over and over again. Just where are we going to get the data? How are we going to clean it? It's not perfect. What are we going to do to impute? How are we even thinking about bias in the imputation or the creation of synthetic data that's going to help us make this data set usable for our purposes? So yeah, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and it's really a passion. So thanks again for having me so I get to talk more about it, which I'm always excited to do. If you go to the next slide, please. So my perspective as somebody who is coming from industry and now thinking a lot about data set standards is thinking about it from the perspective of the user. So I do a lot of user-centered design and work just when I'm building products, and I think about the same thing when I come to the research side. So part of the work that we do at the Data Nutrition Project, which I'll talk more about, is actually talking to people who are in the best position, we think, to actually use the documentation. So when we think about people like you all, I think on this call, who are sourcing data sets, cleaning data sets, and then using them, how can data set standards and documentation standards actually help you perform that? And I think a lot of times, the issues that we see with documentation are around the following kind of 4 on this slide, which is like, how do you actually make it usable, right? So what are the incentives? Why should somebody actually document their data set? It doesn't necessarily have to be top down, a regulatory push. There also needs to be internal momentum, right? That has to be paired with clear expectations and support from leadership. So we talk to a lot of data scientists who are inside of organizations, and they want to do the right thing, but they're on deadline. Their bonuses are tied not to whether they document their systems. It's never tied to whether they document their systems, but rather how much output they have, right? And how their models or their data is drawn directly to the bottom line if they're generating revenue. So you really need to have kind of an ecosystem of incentives and support in order to kind of drive that momentum, a lot of which is coming from the bottom up because people want to do the right thing, which is kind of an amazing thing to see, to be honest. The second is, how do we make sure that documentation actually fits into the existing tasks of people who are on the ground? And this kind of falls into the usability or the usefulness. Now, you might have schema or standards that are, 100 questions that you answer, and maybe that's an audit. It goes into a file. There's a huge PDF that's generated. We worked with one, amazing US agency that has a massive data set they put out, and their documentation is a 55-page PDF. Now, they've put so much love and effort into that 55-page PDF, but if you're on deadline for next Tuesday, I know I'm not going to read 55 pages. I'm probably going to Control F, and I'm just going to go through it and see, is there anything about minorities, or is there anything about, if I'm looking at financial stuff, I'm going to look at transactions, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. So we really need to think about usability and usefulness of the documentation, both from the perspective of those who are making the documentation and also from those that are consuming the documentation. And so the key insight here, it's not rocket science, right? We can reduce that friction by thinking about the existing workflow and focusing on the user experience of how that documentation is going to be consumed. Now, there are obviously technical challenges. Actually, I think Emmanuel's, a lot of his presentation was about exactly this, which is that it's really tough to document large, unstructured streaming data sets. They're changing every day, web scraping, these kinds of things, and it's going to require new tools and approaches. There's a lot of smart people out there. I haven't seen anything that exactly aligned right now with solving this problem, but it will probably be some combination of kind of automation and maybe some kind of auditing is probably, and I think Emmanuel said exactly the same thing. Additionally, we all know there's so many different kinds of data, right? It's not just about data type, but also data domain. So if you're talking about healthcare data, or you're talking about financial transactions, it's very different standards and different things you need to know about those different domains. Additionally, because there's so much cross-domain usage of data, so you take data from one area and you bring it into another domain, and you maybe, add it to that data set or use it to impute some data in that data set. There's probably information that you need to actually document that's more qualitative. And so we're going to need to have different standards and understanding and kind of a shared vocabulary, or at least a definitions of vocabulary of how data is understood in different domains. And finally, engagement. How do we actually engage communities and create culture around data set documentation? There's a example here where indigenous data sovereignty in some ways is incompatible with the open data or open science movement. So you have communities that really want to retain kind of ownership and sovereignty over their data. This goes directly against the notion of open data, right? Open it for everybody for all purposes all the time. And so how do we start to build data governance mechanisms and documentation that falls within that kind of governance that really addresses the nuance in different community values and data values? So these are some challenges, just some small things, give us a few years, right? If you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the data nutrition project. This is, I've wrote this kind of more specifically about DNP and the dataset nutrition label because I think that's the scope of which you kind of wanted me to chat. But I think you can apply this more broadly as well. So on the right-hand side, there's an example of the new version of our label. This is the third version. The first was very quantitative. The second was more qualitative, but maybe a little bit too subjective. We found that dataset owners didn't want to necessarily fill in the label because it was going to point out everything that's wrong with the data. And that's not our intention. Our intention is to make the data more easy to use. This third version is focusing a lot on how to use the data. So the left-hand column, the kind of left 1/3 of the page, is kind of your basic metadata. And then on the right-hand side, we have uses, so intended use, known uses, restrictions on use. These are all interactive, so they open up. And then we have a section on risks. So these are things that are known about the data set that you would want to know if you're going to use the data, so you can make sure you're using it correctly. Quick history on the data nutrition project. We are a small group of researchers, artists, practitioners who in our spare time got together and did a fellowship at Harvard in 2017. The goal of that fellowship was to think about the ethics and the governance of AI. And, a lot of what we saw in the media at that point, is 5 years ago, was about the biased AI, racist AI, sexist AI, these kinds of things. But to us, a lot of us knew that what we were seeing was just a result of bad data, right? Of problematic, biased, incomplete data, the kind that actually Felix, I think, had that exact line in his presentation. So we said, why don't we focus on the data instead? And we were eating a lot of snacks because we were in a university environment, and there was a box of cookies in front of us. And we're like, what would it take to have a nutrition label for a data set? We're not new to this. There's privacy, labels. I know that Emmanuel was talking about the AI standard label, these kinds of things. And we said, what would that actually look like? So that's kind of the nexus of the project. And there are some things here, the opportunities that we've kind of codified in this, but I think are more broadly applicable. So one is the legibility. You want to provide some standardized, accessible information that's going to be the same every time you see it. And so when you think about dataset documentation right now, those 55-page PDFs or those kind of one-page data sheets or those kinds of things, from data set to data set, you see different things. Wouldn't it be cool, just like if you have your box of cookies, that I could take 2 boxes of cookies and I could say, oh, let me compare and contrast these to each other with the same metrics or the same understanding. That's kind of the purpose here, right? And then for us, we're starting to really circle around this idea of understanding the data and using the data with a real emphasis on using the data. And we have a focus on user experience. I think it's kind of the product manager lens that a lot of us come from on the team. In terms of the ecosystem, a lot of other, and I saw a question too in the chat about actual documentation techniques or standards. There's a lot of stuff out there. We leverage a lot of the underlying knowledge structures of these other projects that are amazing. All of us kind of came to be at around the same time. All of our papers kind of came around the same time. And we think some of the work that they're doing is really amazing. Some of it is a little bit more focused on automated, some is more kind of focused on research data sets, smaller data sets. And so ours is really about having this kind of standardized way to read the data and to understand it from a user perspective. And in terms of the impact, we have a short-term goal and a long-term goal. Long-term, wouldn't it be neat if every data set had a label on it? Short term, even just having it on one data set is useful because it helps you understand, again, if you're on deadline for Tuesday, very rapidly, why was this data set created? What are the major components of it that I need to understand? What are the major known issues? So I can use that data set in the best way possible, or decide not to use it, right? If it's not aligned with my intended use. And finally, wouldn't it be really neat if, similar to when I walk into a bakery down the street, there's a really delicious looking donut and there's no label that's attached to it because it's in a bakery, right? But I think about it. Okay, well, let me think about how much sugar is in this, because now the label has changed my awareness and my understanding. And so there's a cultural impact. And so that would be the hope for this as well. If many of the best practices data sets, the standardized data sets that are out there had something like this, or whatever standard it ends up being, and then I go and I find a data set off the internet, it doesn't have this label, I start to ask the same questions that I would have of the standard data sets that have the label, even though the label is not there, right? So that's also kind of a long-term goal. I think that's my last slide, but those are the opportunities that we see that we're trying to address here. And again, I think they're more widely applicable than just for us. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Keisha. Very nice talk as well. I like this metaphor with nutritional products because it's very. I think it has a lot to do with artificial intelligence, indeed. And as you said, it's about usability and usefulness of documentation practices for data sets. Okay, so we can move to our next, last but not least speaker, Flora Dellinger.
Hi.
So the floor is yours, Flora.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next slide. Hi everyone. So my name is Flora Dellinger. So my background is, like you guys, more computer vision and image processing. And I've been a machine learning engineer in the industry for 8 years. And so I'm originally from Valeo, which is an automotive supplier, where I took part of the development of AI-based camera perception modules for ADAS. So I got in touch of real concrete problems about developing AI for the real world, and especially developing data sets. And this is where I've seen the big gap between the papers you read in the internet and what you do in real life. And since last year, I've been involved in the Confiance.ai program. So it's a French consortium with several top one French companies. So we have Valeo, but also Airbus, Thales, Safran, etc. It's mainly industries for transportation or energy. And the common thing between this industry is that we develop critical systems. And so for us, it's not, we don't have the same safety requirement than Google, for example. If we want to have an autonomous car or train or plane, it has to work, and we need to have a safety measure for that. And so it's how the program got developed is how can we bring trust and bring safety to AI-based component. It's new in our industry, where we're not software companies at the beginning, but we need to incorporate that and to bring safety to that. So it's a 4 years program that we started last year. So we had maybe a third of the program. And in this program, I'm in part of the project Trust by Data, where we want to develop methods and tools to obtain trustworthy and relevant data sets for AI. So next slide. Thanks. So the challenge in Confiance.ai, it starts with a common status that we all share, is that today it's quite difficult to assess the behavior of an AI component in real life. You can measure it on your computer, but really to know how it will behave in real life, if someone knows how to say it, let me know. And it's because of why. So few ideas is that data sets are not representative enough of encountered real world situations. So we have biases or domain gap for corner cases. And in our situation we have in Confiance AI, we work on critical systems. Sometimes we have situations that we know exist, but we don't know how to create them. For example, a pedestrian walking on a highway. Instead of using, if you want to acquire that in real life, it's going to be complicated. Data sets also lack quality, but also we lack integrity over the life cycle. It's what my colleagues just said before. You acquire data, but you don't know. You modify it and you do several things on it, and in the end, you've done some changes and you don't know if you can still trust your data. But also one big issue is that the metrics we use these days for AI engineers in order to evaluate AI models, they're still too generic and they're really research oriented. People use MAP or things like that, but it's really a way to measure if your model is better than the other model, but it doesn't give you an idea if your models behave well in the situation you want it to behave on. So that's the main challenges we are facing. And so the question we have now are, how can we build relevant data sets for a specific use case? And how can we ensure the quality of such data set? So in Confiance.ai, we propose some solutions. So we've just started to develop them, but there are some interesting ideas. So first is to create a methodology for data specification and data collection activities. So to guide processes first, because people who collect data these days, it's really an open activity. There are no methodology. They just rely on experience. And in the end, as we say, a lot of data sets have bad quality and they're not really relevant to what they were supposed to be applied for. This methodology needs to ensure the compliance with the input requirements. So with these requirements, it can be safety, functional, but also this new term, I don't know if some people know about it, but the operational design domain. So it's a term that comes from autonomous driving in order to design the domain where an AI component is supposed to work on. And we think it's an interesting concept to specify a data set. Since if you design your operational design domain, you're supposed to know every type, all the data you need to acquire to train, but mainly to test your AI component. And so for that, we're getting inspired by the work done by the association ASAM with OpenODD, Open Scenario, etc. We think it's a good initiative. Our other proposals are to develop metrics for trustworthiness data sets. So several panelists have talked about that before. In order to measure representativity, diversity, traceability, compliance, etc. There are a lot of metrics that we discuss, but we need to translate them now into computation on data sets. And so the final part is really to have tools in order to process and analyze these data sets, in order to facilitate the data processing and to get insight on data set, to really have a view of what is inside. And if you model behavior, if it's not working well, is it because you have a poor model or you have a poor data set? If you don't have the correct tools to do that, you're still really blind. And finally, all these tools need to be integrated in a platform in order to ensure the data integrity. So that's all the idea we've started to develop in Confiance.ai. And finally, last slide. So about the next step. So today, really, there are no standards or methodology commonly accepted in the community for data creation. It really mainly relies on our experience. But really, if we want to save time and not be frustrated by managing datasets, we need to develop new standards. And so what I think is interesting in standards for data format and label in order to facilitate data exchanges and the processes. Usually each industry has its own format. Maybe we can do some standardization for that. Also for the dataset design and collection in order to ensure the relevance of the data we acquire and to guide data acquisition step. And finally, data quality, so that's the thing I've talked about, the metrics, in order to monitor data sets and provide trust in our AI components. Thank you.
Merci, Flora. So this was an industrial view from what is a high-risk sector, as in the European AI Act, for instance, with critical systems in aeronautics, with Thales, Valeo, Airbus, all this industry. So it's really about making systems that might be high risk and that train on data, and these data have to be seriously created. So thanks for raising this view. That complemented very well the previous speakers. So now we can perhaps take some questions from the audience. Our audience is a bit shy. We don't have many questions, but we have some that are very good. For instance, we have for Emmanuel, but can be extended to our speakers, I guess. Who do you think should perform auditing, data auditing? Do you think it should be an internal activity, part of the development process, or an external check? Or so, Emmanuel, if you want to take the floor.
Okay, so we've been wondering this for a while. Like we've been going back and forth about you know, internal audits versus external ones, and if it's external, who's in charge of them. And it's actually our discussion with individuals from the financial industry that kind of helped at least to form a bit of an opinion here. Is that you can have an internal auditing. You can ask companies to internally audit themselves to assure that, you know, that they have compliance to any data standards or regulations they claim to follow. But they should be an external body, almost at I would argue at with some real legal weight, almost like you know, you can have the bodies in charge of regulating, you know, the financial industry that will on occasion randomly sample some of these companies that are claiming to adhere to some data standards and data quality and actually go in and check the books, as in we just simply adopt and extend the model that's come from industries like the financial industry. And I guess this is currently where my point of view sits right now, is that yes, we should have standards, and they should, and if those standards exist, I think companies will try to adhere to them, and how strongly they adhere to them depends on the repercussions of being caught not doing so. So if there is aspect that if you are deploying some model for example, in Europe with the trained on some data set that does not adhere to some standard, then there is a risk that yes, if you're audited this year or at some point while this model is active and there's still evidence of it, then there will be repercussions, and they should be. And whatever entity is auditing should be able to, yes, I can see the point here that financial regulators are doing so poorly that they are regularly closed and renamed, replaced. That is true. That is true. That's a solution. So that, I mean, there's the argument that they're doing poorly, but it's better than what was before. And I have to think about what's I guess practical, at least as a practical starting point, because preferably we'd like to be able to go in and audit every single company. Yeah, go on, Felix.
Could you comment on whether one should be auditing the data or the models?
Both. Yes, you definitely.
So it's twice the work then, I guess.
No, like it's I mean. Data auditing, I think if to do it properly, that's a full kind of career. Like I don't think that, and model auditing, like I think that it's worth the effort to go through and actually have specific auditors just for data sets, especially in critical areas, high value areas, and high risk domains, if you want to say, especially data that's going into high risk AI models. But yeah, I would say that it would you do have to separately, or you could be the same person, but you do have to audit the model because the way the model interacts with the real world, it's contingent on the data, but the data itself has to make sure, like, you know, that you're adhering, that you don't have any illicit material in there, that it's representative of I guess the demographics or the tasks that it's actually being used to. This is, and it's not an easy task to have some external person just come in and see a new data set, which is maybe clean, maybe not that clean. You know, there's different data quality standards. Like, to actually go through and do this, this is a role. This is a specific role, I would imagine. Yeah, does that answer the question? I don't know what everyone else thinks.
I think so. And also, I don't know if it was you, Felix. At a certain moment, you mentioned that we have to correlate model errors with data problems. This is the point, no? This is what we have to audit in the end.
I mean, if we can do that, that would be great. Often this is very difficult, obviously. But if we're worried about the outcome, we should probably be auditing the model, right? But the company that is creating the model should be worried about auditing the data, right? So it's about to me, it's a matter of responsibilities, right? So if we assume a company that's building a model, training something to do, you know, to solve a task, they probably at least want a very good model, right? So they have some kind of interest in getting their data right, while the external organization is more worried about the outcomes, which is the model itself, no matter how they got there. That would be my thinking here, but you know, this is just an idea.
Yeah, so I think also there's kind of an interesting and not super powerful, so don't take it to literal analogy, but if you think about, you know, the medical profession where you have doctors, they can be held for malpractice, right? There's a certain kind of professional liability that comes with performing a task or you know, building something. And same with kind of construction companies that are building buildings, right? But a data scientist has none of this liability. And so I just wonder if we're talking about also mechanisms, you know, sometimes it's useful to think through what people should be responsible for and maybe what falls inside of a job description. So if a data scientist can be held liable for the things that they build that discriminate or are biased, all of a sudden I'm sure you'll see a lot of internal mechanisms at companies. You'll see a lot of standards and certifications and things that pop up because of that kind of that responsibility, which so far data scientists don't have. One other just point is that, you know, we have now all of these roles in the data field: data scientist, data engineer, right? We took all these roles that we had and we put data in front of it because we realized that it was large enough and big enough as a domain that we needed to do that. I think data auditing is just another kind of extension of that model.
I think the analogy is pretty good. So, you know, you could compare, let's say, the construction worker building a house and then blaming the fact that the house fell down on the poor materials that he used, right? And so then the builder should worry about that the material they're using is good, and then, you know that they built a nice house. And in the same way, a data scientist should be worried about the data that she's using to build a model. But the end user, the inhabitant of the house, is not worried about the material. He or she is worried about, will the house, you know, fall down or not? Yeah, but I agree. I mean, I think it's a good analogy. I like it.
And to add to your point, Felix, about caring only about the outcomes, I think there's something subtle here in the sense that you can focus on improving performance and get great performance from your AI models, and, you know, as long as it does not cause too much damage to, or is let's say, doesn't cause your model in the end, doesn't cause any damage to the majority group. If you do have a minority group who are inconvenienced or somehow marginalized by this model due to the data, you know, the model itself performs well for the majority, but it's a problem with the data, so to speak. Then the likelihood of actually them having the power to come through and be able to be like, hey, this thing that was developed by this big tech company is actually very dangerous for us, and we like the ability to actually get to the point where they can institute change at that stage is quite hard, I would say, if not impossible. So I would say be preemptive to actually do it right all the way through the pipeline to actually have data auditors and also auditors for the outcome. But yeah, and one of the comments in there was say that they don't think anyone will pay for audits. And I think Kasia hit on this quite a bit, in the sense that if there is repercussions, and this is something we learned from the finance industry, is that when there are repercustions, they suddenly find the money. They always do. They're like, it's a compliance cost. They budget it in for the next year, and it's a marginal cost. Like the finance industry has to do it all now for credit models and everything else. I don't think that a lot of the organizations in who would be affected by this will have an issue putting aside a budget to adhere to actually internal audits if there's a fear of repercussions.
There's actually a great kind of data point around that, which is the DSAR. Maybe that might be an American term. The data subject access requests services and vendor market, which is exploding because of GDPR, and then a similar kind of bill that came out in California in the US, which says that people have the right to access and then also the right to request to delete their data from a system. And at first everyone was up in arms saying, well, we can't track a single person through the system. I mean, our systems are so complicated, our data's all over the place, we don't know how it moves, and everyone's like, well, isn't that the problem? The problem is not that complying is hard, the problem is that you have no idea what's happening with your data. And now there are all these services, these kind of privacy vendors and services that are exploding as an industry, as kind of like a like a cottage industry, like a middleman industry, that's saying we'll come into your business, small, medium, large businesses, and we'll actually do data mapping, and we'll make it so that it's an automated way that you can actually take someone's request and trace it through the system and delete their data. And so I think that's a good example of how this regulatory, these mechanisms will drive people to find the budget and also create the services to address the need.
Yeah, if I may add, though, that this is also quite dangerous, because basically we're mandating companies to integrate all the data that they have about individuals, which is something that I actually wouldn't like, but suddenly they say, oh, we have to integrate everything, so we know everything about you, even if before it was dispersed in many different departments. Suddenly we have to integrate it, and suddenly they know more about me than before, just because I have the right to remove data.
Yes, perhaps we can let Flora do the last intervention about this passionate topic about auditing and forward.
Yeah, what I wanted to emphasize is that we also need to start to pay attention about talking about data for training, but also data for validation. It's really different. We have they used to say data, but in the end, what is really important is the data you test your model on. And today, I think that it's really not rigorous at all, especially in the research industry, where they just take the data and they just split, etc. And what really we need to focus on before doing the perfect data for training is really have the proper data for validation. And it is close to what Emmanuel said about the part where you have minority. If you do the data for validation well, you should emphasize that you have different group, and you should monitor that and not have a global metric, what we have these days in the research industry.
Absolutely, Flora. And this was also because we have a quite intensive chat in the Zoom, but we asked the attendees to ask questions in the Slido, so it's a bit a mess. But overall, we had a very interesting comment. It was by Johan Leidna. He was raising a similar point as Flora was talking. He was mentioning the NIST benchmarks for validation. So the NIST benchmark are more for face recognition. They have very good benchmarks, but it's about validation training, the data not for training, but for validating models. So they have benchmark for evaluating demographics. They have benchmark for evaluating how well the face recognition system works with people wearing masks, and so on and so on. So yes, I really think it's very important to put the emphasis on validation data, perhaps even more than on training data. So we would like to move now to a brainstorming exercise. So Olivier is sharing the screen. We did this mural So this module has basically three main parts. The one that we call brainstorming, and because of this time limit we have, because we are running out of time, Songul and I have been preparing these sticky notes with three different colors. So in yellow, we have been compiling all the concepts you raised during your talks from data mess. No? Data mess, we all know that data is a mess right now for AI, multimodality issue, the bias and domain gaps issue, how difficult and time consuming is to maintain, prepare clean data, especially when they come from web scraping. We have two generic and research-oriented metrics. We need for more AI-specific metrics, and then also take into account the intended purpose of the AI systems. We have seen, especially with Keisha, that there are some initiatives already ongoing and very good initiatives for documenting datasets. We all know datasheets for dataset. We for sure know the Data and Nutrition Project and AI fact sheets. There are many of them. And the question would be, can we leverage on those for developing future standards, for instance, for AI compliance with the European AI Act? And also we all agreed on that transparency practices are needed, but also on that might be against the interest of private companies, because data is the new gold. And so if I have a company and I have the best data, I will have the best algorithm, I will have the best AI system. So how to make incentives for companies to build this culture of documenting data sets and of course documentation of AI in general. So, well, from what you said, I'm sorry for being so fast because we are really running out of time. We identified in this green color the standardization needs for datasets, for the dataset documentation, for transparency in datasets. And we would like now to move to this second matrix we have. Olivia, if you can move exactly to the mapping one. Here we have a matrix and we have two axes. Let's say the y-axis, the columns, are different aspects of standardization, no? From terminology, this is the taxonomy we use in the field, and that could be eventually translated in standards. It can also be the terminology that is used in regulations, in the AI Act, for instance. We had a question in the Slido, someone asking that, well, you're talking about bias and fairness, but actually these terms are not in the European AI Act. So do we have a common taxonomy for documenting datasets? Do you feel like something is lacking here? Also in terms of measurements, metrics, also in terms of how to characterize the performance of datasets. It's a bit weird to talk about the performance of datasets, but the impact of these datasets on the AI models and systems. Also interoperability, the compatibility, the standard way of labeling data, for instance. And finally, the conformity assessments. Are we ready? The current documentation approaches are ready to be audited as they are conceived, and to have a conformity assessment, for instance, with regard to the European AI Act. So these are the 5 key dimensions for standardization. And then in the rows, we have 3 dimensions, which are more related to the maturity of the AI system. No? So the first row and the bottom row is data creation. And this panel has focused on data creation, actually. And then we have the AI system creation, which would be more in the training phase and validation phase. And then we have the market phase, no? Really deploying the AI system and put it into the market. So I would like to ask you about which standard needs do you foresee, and in which category? So perhaps if you, for instance, Felix, you want to start?
Sure. Do you want to share the link, or are you? Okay, so I'll start. So obviously in the data creation, I think measurement is important, as I mentioned. So I don't know, do you want to put X's somewhere, or what are you looking for?
Yeah,
I mean, probably what we should do is just put an X in every single field and then debate on where it's not important, right? that might be more productive, I think.
Does that work for you in the measurement methodology? We need standards on AI-specific data quality metrics.
Okay, absolutely. And for terminology, I had mentioned this one aspect that we need a language to specify cleaning steps, preparation and cleaning steps. So we can't just have somebody say, I cleaned the data. We need a specific language, in my view anyway, to explain how the data was created and massaged.
Perfect. I don't know if you can see it. Perhaps, Livia, you can zoom a bit on the matrix. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, looks good.
Okay. So then we have perhaps standards on data collection, standards on data sharing, perhaps on data maintenance.
I mean, all of what you're saying is correct, of course. It's just a, I don't know.
If you had to prioritize, which would be the most important standard? Imagine that now we are in the path towards standardization, okay? The European, at least in Europe, the European AI Act is in the proposal phase. And now we are starting to work on ways to standardize so as to prove conformity assessment to the European AI Act. So, for instance,
if you ask me, I think what Kasia said with the data nutrition, this kind of thing should be standardized. So, looking at data and having a description of a static data set, and maybe adding to the nutrition label, explaining how the data got there. Right? Probably that's part of the nutrition label, but maybe the ingredients and the logistics. So, you know, where was the wheat sourced? Where was the sugar created? This kind of thing, I guess. You know, was it fair in terms of fair trade? But here, I guess, in terms of, let's say, fair collection of data and this kind of.
Yes. So you think we can leverage on existing approaches such as the data and nutrition label, right?
Yes. So and is that already part of the? I'm not, you know, I don't know by heart what is all in there.
Yeah, it's perfect. So, Keisha, if you want to add something, perhaps.
I mean, I think this is going in the right direction. I mean, I kind of agree that it's like everything's important, and then it's a question of prioritization. I do just want to point out that I think that whatever we build needs to be flexible, because we don't know what the problems of tomorrow are going to be. So, you know, I think that frameworks that say you test for these kinds of biases against these kinds of groups, for example, is probably too specific. And what you'd want is a standard that says that based on the, you know, protected classes, as we'd say in the US, or minority distribution, you know, whatever it is, you're going to look for these kinds of things and then allow for some kind of interpretation over time. And that's dangerous because you don't want it to be too interpretable. Otherwise, people will they'll game it, right? And they'll say, my data set's perfect. But that's one, I don't know how you capture that. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the grid. But that's one thing I think that's, you know, that's great. Flexibility, yeah, in terms of what exactly the components are within something that is more structured. And I would kind of double down on the standards for bias analysis, because I think that's really interesting. The kind of flip of that is fairness metrics, right? So bias and fairness, and there are many ways to mathematically define fairness, as we all know, and some of them are incompatible with each other. So I think that there are, you know, there's probably a toolkit or standardized, you know, libraries, or at least standard terminology around how we discuss what bias and what fairness metrics we're conforming to, and how we actually measure those, whether it's thresholds or just measurements, right? So those are kind of some of the things that I would call out.
Okay, and I have one question for you related to, okay, we need a certain usability when we are documenting datasets, but at the same time, for conformity assessment, we need to provide very thorough and detailed descriptions of the whole AI system, and particularly on datasets. So do you think we need, we can leverage from existing approaches, but do you think that existing approaches are wide enough, deep enough, I would say, instead of wide, are deep enough for conformity assessment? Perhaps, Emmanuel, you want to mention something related to this?
Oh yeah, no, it's just that. Okay, so I was just backing up what Felix and Kasia have said. So in terms of not keeping it rigid, this is interesting because we've been trying to, like I said, we've trying to put that an all AI quality and AI trust label in collaboration with industry. And under this AI trust label, we have a section on transparency, and this is where the documentation side of things are. And in here, we've similar. I like the nutrition analogy because what we used for the trust label was that in all these metrics like transparency, reliability, also that we've used a metric similar to the energy ratings, A, B, C, D, E, and how an A when all of this conforms directly to as verbatim to like that you get full compliance to the EU AI Act, and then we kind of have because there's some applications where where you might not need full, like let's say, transparency. They're rare, but they are, and it was interesting to actually run into consumer customers, let's say, or industrial partners who made a case, a very backed up case about why some certain types of documentation can never be released regarding some of the AI models. So having something like, and in this framework, we created this tiered kind of metric, which allows some gray. It's a spectrum of conformity, so to speak, rather than hard conformity, yes or no. And then we mapped that spectrum onto things like data sheets and even now nutrition label, for example, to be like, oh yeah, if you produce this piece of documentation at this level of detail, then that pushes you somewhere along this scale. And that we found that at least industrial partners are more comfortable with than having hard compliance, because there they can argue when they do provide, they can, depending on the application and the use case, can be like, yes, for this particular application, facial recognition, we give full transparency because this has huge broad implications. But then for some select system that we're using internally to, I don't know, design some chips, then that really, we don't want to document that at all because that's our own internal secret, so to speak. There should never be any documentation viewable from the outside from it. I don't know if that helps kind of partially answer some of the questions that you put forward.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We called it broader performance dimensions, this ABCD concept. And yes, it would really help for conformity assessment and for auditing, as long as we establish very well what these categories mean. No?
Yeah.
So if I may, I have a comment that will help you or us, I guess, extend what we're doing in the last row up until the higher rows. So I guess in general, there needs to be a way to communicate the effects of whatever you do at the bottom level towards AI system creation and deployment, right? So we have fairness metrics, but you could ask, okay, who cares? How is that relevant then for system creation? How is that relevant for deployment, right? We have standards for data formatting. Why and how are they relevant for system creation and marketing, etc.? So it's really just how do we pull all of those, or how do we show that all the efforts at the bottom row actually are relevant for the higher up rows? Right?
This is a very important point. Also, what do you think about the institution? I mean, the employees of an institution that developing AI systems, they should also have this culture of documenting, no? Especially developers. I used to work with developers and they don't like documentation at all. So do we need standards or some guidelines to foster this culture of documentation?
Just touch on that, like when it comes to documentation, I think that's driven. It's been interesting because now I've started seeing some of the big tech companies, at least whenever they release a model, to release it with a model card, for example, right? And this is change that's coming from within. There might be an aspect where they're like, oh yes, we are trying. Like, there's definitely a group where like we need this as as in within the companies who are like, we should be doing this anyway. But then there's also another aspect where I guess a lot of the companies are trying to show that they're actually preempting and trying to be good actors by providing preemptively such things like descriptions of their systems or data sheets when they release their data. So I think it's a change that comes slowly, but it's it's about normalizing it, because it's you'd say that, yeah, people can't produce documentation, but now I'm like, oh, people do, when they do release an AI model, they're like, yeah, maybe we should actually include our model card. And this is a part of the discourse. I don't think it's nobody ever likes doing documentation, but at some point everyone agrees it's important enough that they start at least making an attempt to do so.
I was thinking about
then I don't.
I think there's also that sounds exactly right to me, Emmanuel, and I feel like there are a lot of really good parallels with the coding, the agile movement and coding culture, and how code that gets commented, and people comment as part of writing the code, and it's there because documentation as an artifact is useful, but it's also very useful as a process. And so I think the closer that documentation can get to the actual creation, the cleaning, the processing of the data set and the creation of the model and the deployment of it, the better, because it ends up being like when you go to class and you take notes, that's a form of documentation. You're not doing it because the teacher's telling you to do it. It's actually useful. So the closer it gets to the actual process and the closer the tools and the kind of workflow, the integrations that we can build there with documentation, I think the better, because there actually is a lot of value of documentation beyond the kind of signaling that you were talking about, where companies are saying we should kind of preempt problems or preempt the public yelling at us by making documentation and putting that out there as well. There's kind of a public benefit and a PR benefit. There's also, I think, internal teams benefit, especially when you're talking about these complex systems that go across multiple teams. And so when the data arrives to the modeling team, it's actually useful for them to know how to use that data. And then when the model gets deployed and needs to be maintained in production, that's going to go to a different team. And so wouldn't it be nice for them to also have some context, because it's now changing hands so many times. So I'd say, like, yes, what you're saying, and also kind of thinking through from the user perspective, how it can be useful as an artifact and a process, not just as kind of like a checking of the box.
And
Yeah,
if I may, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I can say that from our industry point of view, it's something that it's new that we're starting to do, for example, in Valeo, because AI is new still in the industry, and it's really useful to have it now. So we're starting to do it, but we have still no methodology or no tools. I think now with all the digital tools, we can do something way more easier than doing a PDF. And I think maybe that's maybe the project that KGI is working on looks quite interesting, and I think the focus these days should really be now about the part compatibility interface, about having tools to document that easier, because developers can be lazy for that.
It's exactly what I wanted to say.
I would also add on to that thread of end users, in the sense that if you're looking at even the producers of data sets now, same thing in the modeling world, is that if there is an expectation from the users that they want to know where the data comes from, there's an awareness aspect of this, that they would like, if you have a choice between a data set that is well commented, has a nutrition label, or a data sheet, and it's like at least certified as usable for a particular domain in some way, I think that will incentivize the creators of the data sets to actually do that extra step, to have that extra bit of information, because the end user cares about it. And the reason why the end user cares about it is because, first of all, they're aware of the issues. So there's an awareness aspect. And if there's an awareness and expectation, I think that it bleeds through to the developers, whether they like it or not, simply because they want their things to be used.
Okay, so thank you very much. We need to close the panel, and I would like to raise a last challenge for the four of you, as you are awesome and you like challenges, I guess. Huh? So can we move Lydia to the prioritization one? So one keyword from each of you. Okay, here we have again a matrix. We like a lot the matrices in the European Commission. So we have feasibility, how easy or difficult it is to implement a given standard, let's say, and importance in the y-axis. So the how important it is for the AI community or for AI practitioners. No? So we have two hot points in this matrix. What is difficult to implement, but important to have right now in terms of data set creation and documentation. And the other hot point is what is very easy and could be rapidly implemented and also important. So Felix, would you like to add one keyword?
Well, of course, I have to add data prep as a keyword. And if you don't want data prep as a, and it's of course difficult and important, obviously. And if you don't want to add data preparation as a method, you could just say a data prep language, which would then be a standardization issue and not so much an algorithmic issue. There you go.
Okay. Emmanuel, another keyword?
I would probably say something along those lines, because I do think that there is data, I guess that data prep, I mean, data curation, it's the same thing, right? Like, and the tools around that. I don't know if I can add more than what Felix has added there. Prioritization, data prep. Okay, no, I'll do easy and important. Easy and important is having a standard kind of checklist, kind of like taking like the idea of like a Cassia's or like data sheets and finding some way to kind of turn that into like just a checklist for people to start benchmarking themselves by, to understand where they sit relative to the conformity with the AI Act and all other regulations. So that's a simple document, I would guess, or digital process, as Flora said, like some kind of, instead of just a PDF, something interactive.
Yes. So. Checklists are very useful indeed. Okay, Kezia, you want to add something? Perhaps if you already agree with what has been said, you can just reinforce.
Yeah, I'm really glad I had my coffee. This is a tough one. I would say easy and important is not the compliance with, but rather the requiring of kind of data lineage and provenance mapping to models. I think it's an easy thing to say you have to do it. It's incredibly hard to actually do it, but by forcing it, it will open the space, the funding, and put some great minds at work to actually do it. So I think that's a place in which an easy thing to put into a regulation could then kind of trigger a bunch of really hard things that are important.
That's perfect. And Flora, perhaps something about industry?
Yeah, it's the thing that for my opinion, is the most important these days, but in the industry, is about data specification, having tools to ensure that we can really track from the use case to the data to the models that we are compliant. And so automated data specification and related to language standards also. It's something that we really are lacking these days, but it's going to be complicated.
So this was my question. So it's difficult, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for this crazy exercise. It was a bit ambitious. We are sorry for it. But at the same time, I think it was interesting to reflect on that. So thank you very much, the four of you. It was a pleasure to share this panel with you. And now we close this session on dataset creation and documentation, and it also closes the workshop for today. I would like to thank all our panelists and all of you for your attendance. I hope to see you tomorrow again for our second PSIS, Putting Science into Standard workshop on dataset for AI. And tomorrow we will have different panels focusing on data quality and AI bias mitigation nets in specific sectors. We will include, we have panels for education, for law enforcement, finance, social media, medicine, and robotics. And then we will have a plenary session in the afternoon compiling all the findings. in these 6 parallel panels that will be held by sector. So we hope to see you tomorrow again, and have a nice evening, and see you soon.
Thank you for leading this nice panel.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks for
Pleasure.
Thank you.
facilitators.
It's
Take
been
care.
a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.